Hey, what is going on, folks? My name is Hellbent and welcome to this third tutorial in the topic of creating games in AutoHotkey. In this one we're going to be looking at jumping and creating simulated gravity for your player. So let's begin. To set this up, I've gone ahead and created a little game script that basically shows you what it'll look like if you add graphics to it, because right now we're still not working with any visual graphics or anything. We're just working with the basic fundamental principles of it without doing the animation and everything. So I've created this little thing where it shows, I have Mario, he can run, he can jump, etc., etc. So we're going to be looking at the jumping aspect and adding gravity. So let's when I created this, I also added in the ability so that way I can adjust the properties of it, or the gravity, how fast he jumps, the terminal velocity and everything like that. And so basically there's four elements that we're going to be working with, or four variables basically that we're going to be looking at, and three of them are pretty much essential, and the fourth one is kind of an optional thing depending on what the application is. So jump, when I have my player to jump, what I'm doing is I want to subtract from its current position in an upwards direction towards the top of the screen. So since the top of my screen is where y equals 0, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to subtract from my player's position each frame of animation. So each frame that it runs through the game cycle, it's going to subtract a certain amount of pixels from the player's position, and the amount that it is determined by the thrust, or the jump power. So if I increase the jump power of my player, he'll jump higher. If I want my player to jump up fast, but I also want him to fall fast, so basically I want my player to only jump a little bit in height, but I want that jump to be really quick, what I can do is I can increase the gravity. So rather than my player jumping all the way up to the top of the screen, now it's going to jump only a little bit, but it's going to jump really quickly. Right? And if I want that to go a little bit faster, I can increase gravity a little bit more, and whatever my range is. Right? So I can make my player really jump really fast. What else I can do is I can set it so that way there's the maximum terminal velocity, so that way when it starts to fall again, I can limit the speed that it'll fall. So rather than him falling, I can make him float. So if I set the max fall speed to a low value, when he jumps, so I'll make him jump pretty high, when he jumps, rather than him falling straight down, he sort of floats down to the ground. Right? Just so you know, I haven't added any physics except for the graph. Like, I haven't added any collision, so I can't actually interact with any of those things. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. What we'll also look at is if you want to create like a bird simulator, like a Flappy Bird kind of clone kind of game. I'll show you how to create that kind of jumping system, which is basically the same thing. It's a jumping system where gravity, you apply a upwards force, and then gradually gravity chips away at that until it starts to fall. So here's an example of that, where I can flap and fly. So each time I flap, it goes up a little bit, and then gravity starts working, pulling it down. And if I hit something, it kills me. Okay, so let's try to get through the beginning of this quickly. So I have a new script here. I'm just going to set it to single instance and single instance force. I'm going to add an emergency exit hotkey. Don't need it, but I always add something. Exit app. So if I press this Control plus Escape, it's going to exit my script. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set up those two little GUI windows. I'm going to make my main window that our player is going to be jumping on. Now remember, we're just going to be using simple graphics. So in fact, our player is going to be represented by a button. Just one of the GUI buttons. Don't worry, later on in a tutorial down the road, I will go on to adding visuals and animation and everything like that. But this is just the beginning stuff. This stuff is actually much more important than the visuals of it. So I'm going to create two GUIs. The first one I'm going to name number 1, and I'm going to set its color to black so that way the button stands out. And then I'm just going to show it. For now, I'm going to add the other stuff afterwards. I'm going to position it on my window with my resolution to X800 and Y100, depending on your resolution. If you want it off to the right hand side like I have it, you'll have to adjust that value. I'm going to set its width to 500 and its height to 500. These values you can use the same. I'm just going to call the name of it the game. It doesn't matter if I give it a name or not. And now I'm going to create the second window, which is going to be the control panel. To do that, I'm going to separate my code a little bit. So I'm just going to put a comment, and then I'm just going to put some dashes, and then I'm going to duplicate this line a couple of times by pressing Control D. Okay, just so that way it separates the code a little bit, because when you get into a really long script, you want to have something a way of being able to find things easily. In here, I'm going to do GUI. I'm going to call this one GUI2, and I'm going to set its color to black as well, because I like black rather than the gray default background. And I'm just going to show it for now. GUI2 show. I'm going to position this one up at the top left hand corner of my screen, so I'm going to do X0, Y0. You can use these same values, doesn't matter your resolution. And I'm going to let it size itself, so I'm not going to give it add it a width or a height. I'm going to let it, whatever the controls that I add to it afterwards, that'll determine its size. I'm going to give it a name. I'm just going to call it controls. And then I'm going to go down a couple lines, and I'm going to add in a return to exit out of the auto execute area. Next, I'm going to add in the GUI close label, so that way if I hit the X on the big window, it'll exit out of the script. GUI close, exit app. Okay, there we go. So to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of variables that are going to represent some of those values we looked at before, or that I talked about before. The first one that we're going to talk about is the velocity. So the velocity is only going to apply when we're actually jumping. So if we're jumping, we're going to take this velocity variable and we're going to add our thrust or our jump speed to it, or we're going to change it to our thrust speed. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that velocity, and each frame of animation that we have, we're going to subtract, or in the case, because the bottom of our screen is where X is higher number, what we're going to do is we're going to add gravity to our thing. So the first variable we're going to create is called velocity, or VOL. The name doesn't matter. I can call this Bob for all it really matters. This is just what I want to call it. I can call it Bob. I'm going to set a value of 0. The next thing I'm going to create is the thrust. So when I jump, this is what it's going to change the velocity to in an upwards direction. So when I jump, oops, wrong button. When I jump upwards, because the top of my screen is where X equals or Y equals 0, what I need to do with my thrust is it's going to be a negative number, because I want to move my player upwards when I jump. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it thrust. Remember, the name doesn't matter. I can call it whatever I want. And I'm going to set it to a value of, let's say, -6. So remember, I have to use a negative number because I want my player to move up. If I want to flip the game over and have him walking on the ceiling, then the thrust would be a positive number and gravity would be a negative number. But in this case, I'm going to be walking along the bottom. When I press up, I want to go up. So it has to be a negative number. The next variable I'm going to create is I'm going to call gravity. And gravity is a additive number. So I'm going to take, so when I jump, the velocity is going to instantly equal -6. So I'm going to be moving up to the top of the screen 6 pixels every frame. Also, each frame I'm going to add to that a downwards force of gravity. So gravity has to be a very small number because it's cumulative, right? So to begin the first frame, I'll be moving up at 6, -6. Then the next frame, let's say if my gravity is 0.5, I'll be going up still at 5.5, and then 5, and then 4.5, and then after about 10 frames, I'm gonna stop moving upwards, and then after that, I'm gonna start moving downwards. So I'm gonna set gravity to 0.2. The next one I'm going to create is the max fall speed. So I'm just going to call it max speed, because why not? And I'm going to set it to a value of 10. So as I'm falling towards the bottom, as I start falling towards the ground, if my gravity changes my velocity to anything greater than 10, it's not going to add anything more. It's just going to keep falling 10 pixels per frame. Okay, so there's the 4 variables that I need. So in the second GUI now, I'm going to add those sliders. So I'm going to go over this quick because this isn't about adding sliders to a GUI. Like, this is kind of all optional stuff that I'm doing here. So GUI 2. But it does help when you're playing around with a new program to see the optimal, because if you don't want if the gravity's too high, or if the thrust speed is too high, or you have to play around with these numbers a little bit. So having a little control panel off to the side to adjust them makes testing a lot easier, or getting the optimal speed for your game or whatever a lot easier. So GUI 2, I'm going to add a slider. I'm going to position it at X10, Y10. I'll give it a width of 100. I'm going to set a range of 1 to 30. I could set the range to whatever I want, but I'll just do 1 to 30. And because I don't want to add an edit field or anything like that. So in order to display what the slider currently has, I'll add the option to put a tooltip in it. And then I'm going to associate this with a variable. Now, because I want to keep this all positive numbers. I don't want to bother switching this to negative numbers in here. So what I need to do is I need to create a new variable that's associated with this, and then after we execute a label later, we'll switch it so that way that thrust equals whatever our slider is times -1. So we'll change it to a negative number. So whatever we get for our slider will change to a negative number afterwards. So I need another variable to have here, and I'll call this jump speed. And I'm going to attach this to a label, and I'm going to call the label set jump speed. Let me clear up that. So I attach to a label set jump speed, and for the default value that this will have, I'll set it to the same as our thrust. So I'll set it to 6. Now because I'm a slow typer, I'm just going to copy the name of the label, set jump speed. And I'm going to come down under here and paste that in, and then add in a return right away. So every time we adjust the slider, it's going to execute into this. So the first thing we need to have happen is we need it to update the value into this variable of whatever the slider says. So to do that, we'll say GUI, comma, the GUI number 2, and the subcommand is submit. And then comma, no hide. And then what we'll do is we'll exchange the value from the slider into the value of the thrust. So we'll say thrust equals the value of our slider, which I called jump speed, times -1. So we'll switch it from a positive number to a negative number. Next, beside the slider, I'll put some text just to say what it does. So I'll do GUI, comma, 2, colon, add, comma, text. I'll set the color. Because the default color is the same as the GUI, I'm going to have to change the color. So I'll do C and white. And I'll position it at X plus 10. X plus 10. So wherever our slider ended, we'll go 10 pixels over and put the text. Okay, that's our first one out of the way. Let's do the next one. The code for the next two things are pretty much the same. There's a little bit of difference. So I can just copy this. Oh, wait. Forgot to actually add the text. So after X plus 10, comma, and the text I'll have is jump speed. Okay, so now I'm going to copy these two lines. And I'm going to go down and paste it in and edit it. So this is the same, this is the same. The first thing we need to change is the Y10. We can get rid of that because we're going to be dropping underneath all that stuff. That can be the same, that can be the same, that can be the same. We need a new variable, so this one is going to be our gravity. So because I have to do a little bit of switching with the gravity, I'm going to need another variable for this. So to make this simple, I'm just going to call this grav, and we're going to change the label to set gravity. Set gravity. We're going to set its default value to 2. And then I'm going to take this label and create it down here. Set gravity, colon, drop down line, return. Once again, the first thing we need to do is update the variable with GUI2 colon submit, no hide. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the variable gravity and I'm going to set it to equal the value of our slider, which I called grav. And we need to convert that into decimals, so we're going to do grav times 0.1. So if the gravity is set to 10 on the slider, it'll be actually 1 for gravity. Or if it's set to 9, it'll be 0.9. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm going to take these two lines. I'm going to copy them. Oh, wait, I need to change this to gravity. And I'm going to drop down a bit, paste that in, and change. So everything's the same, same, gravity. Okay, this one is a 1-for-1 ratio, so whatever we set the slider, it's also going to be set the same for the max speed. So we don't need a separate variable for this. We'll just take this max speed variable, and we'll change this variable with that. We'll change set gravity to set max speed. So the label is going to be set max speed. I'm going to set this to be the same as I have up there. Okay, and I'll copy the name of the label. And this time, all we need to do inside of this label, when we move that slider, all we need to happen is we need to just do our GUI submit. GUI2 colon submit, comma, no hide. Return. Okay, and I'll change the text to represent max speed, max fall speed. Okay, so there we go. We can run this now, and we should get a slider up here, 3 sliders up there with text beside them. Oh, I forgot. Wait, something's wrong. Oh, there it is. I was wondering why I wasn't getting a tooltip, but yeah, we're getting a tooltip. Okay, so that's that out of the way. Now let's go ahead and add our player into our game. Before we add our player, what we'll do is we'll create a player object to hold most of its values. So I'm going to call the player object, I'm going to call it player. I'm going to set it to equal an object, and in this object we're going to have a couple of keys. I'm going to call the first one X, and X is going to represent where its X position is, and I'm just going to center it. I'm going to create a button that is 50 pixels by 50 pixels, so about that big, and I'm going to set it to be down here at the bottom of the screen. So X I'm going to set to 225. Y I'm going to set to 450. Width I'm going to set to 50 pixels. Height, I'm going to set to 50 pixels. And I'm going to add one more variable that I'm going to call jumping. So this variable is going to, if we jump, it's going to change the value of this. So if we're just standing still, the value of this variable is going to be one thing. If we jump, so if we're in the air, it's going to be something else. And then if we land again, it's going to be set back to what it was in the beginning. So to begin with, this variable that I'm going to call jumping is going to equal 0. So at the beginning, we're on the ground, we're not jumping, so jumping equals 0. If we jump, jumping is going to become 1, and that way we'll be able to track whether we're in the air or if we're on the ground by following the value of this variable. Jumping equals 0. Okay, I hate forcing an expression inside of a GUI control. So what I'm going to do, instead of actually putting this stuff in here as an expression, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take these same values that I have here and I'm going to hard code them in, because we're not going to be adjusting this. What you should do is force the expression, but I covered that in the first 2 tutorials, so you should know that, how to do that. So I'm going to add in I'm going to use a button, like I said. So GUI 1 add button. I'm going to set its X position to be the same as I have the X up there, which is 225. The Y position to be 450. The height width to be 50. The height to be 50. I'm going to associate a variable with it. I'm going to call this variable player underscore 1, and that's all we need for that. I'm going to put some text on our button to make it stand out a little bit more. I'm going to call it me. And we are good. So let's go ahead and have a look at our player. Should be at the bottom. Oh, wait. What do we got? Oh, I set equals. So jumping, not equals, colon. Jumping colon 0. There we go. So here's our player. It's a button, but when we press it, it doesn't do anything. And it's never going to do anything. We're just using it as a graphics. Okay. So now that we have that, what we need to do is have our game loop, or our game cycle. So down underneath our second GUI, just before our return, what we're going to do is we're going to set a timer. And this is going to be our frames, or our game cycle. So it's going to loop, 30 times a second, 40 times a second, 50 times a second, whatever. I'm going to call it cycle, and I'm going to set it to 10 milliseconds. Down underneath my other labels here, I'm going to create the subroutine cycle, add in its return, and what we'll do is, the first thing we'll do is we'll set it up so that way we can move our player to the left and right. Okay, so to do that, what we'll do is we'll say if get key state left and player dot x is, so if we're pressing left, our player is going to be moving in this way. What we need to do is make sure that our player doesn't go out of bounds. So we'll check if we're pressing the left arrow key and player X is a value greater than 0. Now, before I mentioned that depending on how fast we're moving, we might end up having our player halfway outside of the screen if we don't set a test to see if we've gone past the edge, but we're not going to worry about that this time. Because I'm only going to need one line of code in here, I don't need to add my French braces. So if I press left and the player is still in the screen, take the value that's in player.x and we will subtract minus, let's say 6 pixels. So every time I press left, it moves 6 pixels to the left. Else if get key state, I'm just rushing over this because I covered this stuff in the first 2 tutorials. If I press right, and player dot x is less than 500 minus player dot width player dot x plus equals 6. Okay. Now comes where if we're pressing up. So if we'll make it so that way he flies first, and then I'll add in the code afterwards to make it so that he only jumps, because it's easier to type out the code to make him fly, and then afterwards I'll add a little tiny bit more code to make it so that it just jumps. So I'll say if get key state up. So if I press the up key, we won't check anything else yet. What we'll do is, because there's a few points that I want to point out, so I'm going to set it up to be something bad first, and then I'll explain what we can do to fix that after. Okay, so if we're pressing the up key, what we're going to do is we're going to take the value of velocity, which is to begin with is set to a value of 0. What we're going to do is we are going to set it to the upwards thrust of when we jump. So whatever we set our jump speed to, so right now it's set to -6. So if we press up, we're going to change velocity to equal the same thing as our upwards thrust. If we didn't do it this way, like if I set it to velocity equals velocity plus thrust, we would end up going up faster and faster and faster and faster and faster each time we press up. So instead, we're just going to set the upward speed to be our thrust speed. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that player dot jumping variable, and I'm going to set it to a value of 1, because if we're jumping, we are jumping. Okay. And then that's it for that for now. The next thing I will do is we're going to check to see if we are currently jumping. So we're going to say if we are jumping, if player is jumping, if player dot jumping equals 1, what we're going to do is we're going to apply our gravity to our velocity. So we're going to say that our velocity plus equals our gravity. But what if we want to have our max speed? What if we actually want to use our third slider to set our terminal velocity? So what we'll do is we'll set it so that way it only applies gravity if our velocity is still lower than our threshold, or our terminal velocity. So inside of here we'll do another test. We'll say if our, what did I call that? Max speed. So if our velocity is still less than our max speed, then go ahead and apply gravity again to our velocity. So let's say if our max speed is 10 and our gravity is equal to 1, so our velocity equals 9 is less than our max speed, so go ahead and take our velocity and apply our gravity to it. So now our gravity equals 10. The next time it goes through our loop, it's going to come into here. We're still jumping. Our velocity now equals 10. Our velocity is less than, here, let's make this equal, less than or equal. So our velocity is our velocity less than or equal to our max speed? No, it's not. So stop applying gravity to our velocity. So our velocity will be capped out at our max speed. Okay, that's it for that. The next thing what we'll do is we will test to see if our player is still in the game board. So let's say this is the bottom of our screen and this is our player. We'll test to see if our player is still in the screen. If our player has moved below the bottom of our screen when it applied our physics here, what we'll do is we'll set it so that way we're sitting on the ground and we're no longer jumping. We'll say if the player Y, if player Y is greater than 500 minus the player height, we'll check to see, should we, like we could do it where we're checking to see if we're jumping too. So that's what we'll do. We'll check to see, because if we're playing a game where we have other platforms or whatever, a better thing would probably be to check if we're jumping as well. So we're checking to see if we're landing on something and if we're still jumping. So we'll do and player dot jumping equals 1. So if we've fallen below that level and we're jumping. What we'll do is we will say we are no longer jumping, so player dot jumping is now equal to 0. We will reset our velocity back to 0, even though we don't, in this case we don't need to, because each time we jump up that's the only time it's gonna reset the velocity. So we don't actually need to do this, but prudence says to do it, so I'm gonna do it. Velocity equals 0. We will setting it to 0 is okay. I'm thinking of where I want to put where I add. See, right now we haven't done anything with the y-axis. So we're setting it up so that way afterwards we're going to apply the velocity to the player's y position, but we haven't done that yet. I'm just trying to think of where I want to put that in my code to be most efficient. And we're not going for optimization here. We're not going for total optimization. This code that we'll have is perfect for what we're doing. Okay, so we're going to reset jumping to 0. We're going to set the velocity to 0. And we're going to set... Okay, I see where I'm going to do it. I see what I'm going to do. Okay, so if the player is jumping, we are going to, regardless of whether this is true or not, so if our velocity is still less than our max speed, go ahead and take our velocity and add gravity to it again. After that, what we're going to do is we're going to take our player dot y, our player's y position, and we're going to plus equals velocity. So let's say if we're moving downwards 10 pixels per frame, we're going to take our y position and subtract 10 from it. So if velocity equals 10, we're going to add that to our y position. In here, if we've gone to the bottom of the screen, what we're going to do is not only are we going to say we're not jumping anymore, not only is our velocity 0, but we're also going to take our player's y position, because if it ended up dropping below our bottom of our screen here, what we're going to do is we're going to say this doesn't count anymore. Instead, our player's y position equals where we want it to be, which is the bottom of the screen minus the player's height. In this case, that's what it is equal to. Okay, so if we press up, go ahead and put thrust into our velocity. Say that we're jumping. If we're jumping, apply gravity to us. Blah, blah, blah. If we fall below the screen, we're no longer just jumping. Set our player's position back to the ground. And now what we'll do is we will just move our player. I think that's all we need to do. So if not, we'll fix it up. GUI control, we're going to be working with GUI 1. The subcommand is move. We're going to be moving player _1, and we're going to be moving it to x player.x y y. Don't forget to add that space there in between the quotes. Player.y. And that's the end of our cycle. So it's going to test to see if we're pressing left or right or up, and then if it's doing any of those, it's going to do our little math. So let's go ahead and run our program, and we'll do a test. If I press left, I move left. If I press right, I move. Whoa, why is that? Oh, I see. This isn't. It's not minus 6. It's minus equals 6. My bad. So if I press left, it's going to take player X and minus 6 from its current value. So if it equaled 10, now it's going to equal 4. All right. There. Left and right. If I press up, it's going to jump. Now because this is flight, this is right now it's set to be flight. So if I hold the up arrow, it's just going to keep flying out of the screen. Okay? If I just press it once, it'll go up and then gravity will pull it down. But I can also just tap up and it'll sort of go like this. Now what I want to do is, right now if I hold up, it's going to constantly just keep going up and up and up and up. That's probably not what I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create in the player's object, I'm going to create another variable, and this one I'm going to call can jump. So this is a control variable that says whether or not I'm allowed to jump. It's not whether or not I am jumping, it's saying if I can jump. And the condition that I'm going to use to change this value is if I press up, I have to release up in order for me to press up again. So inside of here, inside of if get key state up, I'm going to add something else. I'm going to say and, or ampersand, and player dot can jump equals 1. So to begin with, the player is allowed to jump. If I press up and the player is allowed to jump, go ahead and jump. But take the value of that player can jump and make it so that way I can't jump. Player dot can underscore jump colon equals 0. So now if I am jumping, I'm not allowed to jump until something else happens to change it so that way I can jump again. And what can make it so that way I can jump again? It's whether I release the up key. So I'm going to say else right after the if get key state up, I'm going to say else if, and then in parentheses the first thing I'm going to type is an exclamation point, which means not. So if I'm not pressing the up key, if exclamation point get key state up and player dot can jump equals 0. So if I'm not pressing up and the player is not allowed to jump, then take the player can jump variable and change it back to being 1. Player.can jump. So if I press up, it'll do my jump, but in order for me to jump again, I have to actually let go of the up key and then press it again. Oh, in here, it's up. If not get key state up and player can jump equals 0, player can jump. Okay, so now if I run this again, this time if I hold up and then let it fall back down, it's not going to jump again until I let go of the up arrow and then press it again. So it's going to jump, hit the ground. Now if I want to fly, I have to constantly tap up. And here, let's increase the jump speed to a fairly high number, increase gravity to a fairly high number, and I'll increase max fall speed to a fairly high number. And this is Flappy Bird. There you go, Flappy Bird. Minus the animation. Okay, so that's jump. I'm flying. Let's look at jumping now. What if I want it so that way I can't jump while I'm in the air? To do that, to make it so that way we can't, if we're already in the air, then what we'll do is in our get key state, so when we press the up arrow, what we'll do is we'll do another little thing in here to test, to see. We'll say and player dot jumping equals 0. So if our player is not jumping, or if the value of player dot jumping is 0, so if we're not jumping, then we can jump. So we have to press up, the player has to be allowed to jump, and the player can't currently be jumping. Then we can jump. And I think we have it already set up so that way once we land on the ground, we set the value of jumping back to 0, so that way we can jump again. So now if we run it again, if I press and hold the up arrow, it'll go and it'll land. If I want to jump again, I have to let go and press it again. But if I'm in the air, it doesn't matter how many times I press it, it has to wait for me to hit the ground before I can jump again. So this is jumping. And if I want, I can jump higher. I can jump faster. And I can float. Okay, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you liked. If you did enjoy it and you would like to see more of these kind of tutorials, be sure to hit that like button. After perhaps a couple more tutorials, if this tutorial series doesn't meet my expectations of feedback from people, then I'm just going to stop doing it and I'll go on to do whatever else I want to do. But so if you'd like to see more of these kinds of tutorials, if you would like this series to continue, be sure to take the 2 seconds it takes to hit the like button, leave a comment, blah blah blah, right? It takes hours for me to do these tutorials. If you can't take 2 seconds to hit the like button, go fuck yourself. That's my opinion. But anyways, what I'm thinking for the next tutorial, you can leave a comment down below if you watch this video before I get to the next video. But what I'm thinking is perhaps doing a tutorial on adding a simple NPC or a simple AI for an enemy, or just other non-player controls, or working on a grid system for movement, which has a lot of things that you can do with grid system movement. But anyways, those are probably one of those topics are probably going to be the thing that I cover next, which will be, I don't know when, who knows. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something. Let me know down in the comments if you make something out of this. But anyways, peace out.